Hello. I'm going to read you a little bit more. This time, it's Robert Louis Stevenson, Kidnapped. Wonderful book. Now, pretend that you're 8 years old and pretend that you don't care that your auntie doesn't get the accents all right, fudges the odd word, hasn't rehearsed, gotten all perfect, and pretend that you don't care that the book is way, way older than your grandpa, that it isn't on the bestseller list, that you're not going to get it in a comic format, and just go with the flow. On the forenoon of the second day, coming to the top of a hill, I saw all the country fall away before me down to the sea, and in the midst of this descent, on a long ridge, the city of Edinburgh smoking like a kiln. There was a flag upon the castle, and ships moving or lying anchored in the firth, both of which, for as far away as they were, I could distinguish clearly, and both brought my country heart into my mouth. Presently after, I came by a house where a shepherd lived, and got a rough direction for the neighbourhood of Cramond, and so from one to another worked my way to the westward of the capital of Cullenton, till I came out upon the Glasgow road. And there, to my great pleasure and wonder, I beheld a regiment marching to the fifes, every foot in time, an old red-faced general on a grey horse at the one end, and at the other the company of grenadiers with their popes' hats. The pride of life seemed to mount into my brain at the sight of the redcoats and the hearing of that merry music. A little farther on, and I was told I was in Cramond parish, and began to substitute in my inquiries the name of the house of Shaws. He's going to see his uncle. He's an orphan. He has no money, no kin except this uncle he's never met, for some reason. It was a word that seemed to surprise those of whom I sought my way. At first I thought the plainness of my appearance, in my country habit, and that all dusty from the road, consorted ill with the greatness of the place to which I was bound. But after 2, maybe 3, had given me the same look and the same answer, I began to take it in my head there was something strange about the Shaws itself. The better to set this fear at rest, I changed the form of my inquiries, and spying an honest fellow coming along a lane on the shaft of his cart, I asked him if he had ever heard tell of a house they called the House of Shaws. He stopped his cart and looked at me, like the others. "Aye," he said. "What for?" "It's a great house?" I asked. "Doubtless," says he. "The house is a big, muckle house." "Aye," said I. "But the folk that are in it?" "Folk?" cried he. "You daft! There's nae folk there to call folk." "What?" says I. "Not Mr. Ebenezer?" "Oh, aye," says the man. "There's the laird, to be sure, if it's him you're wanting. What'll like be your business, Manny?" I was led to think that I could get a situation, I said, looking as modest as I could. "What?" cries the carter, in so sharp a note that his very horse started, and then, "Well, Manny," he added, "it's nane of my affairs, but you seem a decent-spoken lad, and if you'll take a word from me, you'll keep clear of the Shaws." The next person I came across was a dapper little man in a beautiful white wig, whom I saw to be a barber on his rounds. And knowing well that barbers were great gossips, I asked him plainly what sort of a man was Mr. Balfour of the Shaws. "Hoot, hoot, hoot," said the barber. "Nae kind of a man, nae kind of a man at all," and began to ask me very shrewdly what my business was, but I was more than a match for him at that, and he went on to his next customer, no wiser than he came. I cannot well describe the blow this dealt to my illusions. The more indistinct the accusations were, the less I liked them, for they left the wider field to fancy. What kind of a great house was this, that all of the parish should start and stare to be asked the way of it? What sort of gentleman, that his ill fame should be thus current on the wayside? If an hour's walking would have brought me back to Essendine, I'd have left my adventure then and there, and returned to Mr. Campbell's. But when I had come so far away already, mere shame would not suffer me to desist till I had put the matter to the touch of proof. I was bound, out of mere self-respect, to carry it through. And little as I liked the sound of what I heard, and slow as I began to travel, I still kept asking my way, and still kept advancing. So, eventually, he gets to Crawford, and he meets his uncle, and his uncle doesn't actually even want to let him in. But then he changes his mind. For a day that was begun so ill, the day passed fairly well. We had the porridge cold again at noon, and hot porridge at night. Porridge and small beer was my uncle's diet. He spoke but little, and that in the same way as before, shooting a question at me after a long silence, and when I sought to lead him in talk about my future, slipped out of it again. In a room next door to the kitchen, where he suffered me to go, I found a great number of books, both Latin and English, in which I took great pleasure all the afternoon. Indeed, the time passed so lightly in this good company that I began to be almost reconciled to my residence at Shaw's, and nothing but the sight of my uncle and his eyes playing hide-and-seek with mine revived the force of my distrust. One thing I discovered, which put me in some doubt. This was an entry on the fly-leaf of a chapbook, one of Patrick Walker's, plainly written by my father's hand, and thus conceived, to my brother Ebenezer on his 5th birthday. Now, what puzzled me was this, that as my father was of course the younger brother, he must have either made some strange error, or he must have written, before he was yet 5, an excellent, clear, manly hand of writing. I tried to get this out of my head, but though I took down many interesting authors, old and new, history, poetry, and storybook, this notion of my father's hand of writing stuck to me, and when at length I went back into the kitchen and sat down once more to porridge and small beer, the first thing I said to Uncle Ebenezer was to ask him if my father had not been very quick at his book. "Alexander? No, him," was the reply. "I was far quicker myself. I was a clever chappie when I was young. I could read as soon as he could." This puzzled me yet more, and a thought coming into my head, I asked if he and my father were twins. He jumped upon his stool, and the horn spoon fell out of his hand upon the floor. "What gars ye ask that?" he said, and he caught me by the breast of the jacket and looked this time straight into my eyes. His own were little and light and bright like a bird's, blinking and winking strangely. "What do you mean?" I asked, very calmly, for I was far stronger than he and not easily frightened. "Take your hand from my jacket. This is no way to behave." My uncle seemed to make a great effort upon himself. "Dod, man, David," he said, "you shouldn't speak to me about your father. That's where the mistake is." He sat a while and shook, blinking in his plate. "He was all the brother that I ever had," he added, but with no heart in his voice, and then he caught up his spoon and fell to supper again, but still shaking. Now this last passage, this laying of hands upon my person and sudden profession of love for my dead father, went so clean beyond my comprehension that it put into me both fear and hope. On the one hand, I began to think my uncle was perhaps insane and might be dangerous. On the other, there came up into my mind, quite unbidden by me and even discouraged, a story like some ballad I heard folks singing, of a poor lad that was a rightful heir and a wicked kinsman that tried to keep him from his own. For why should my uncle play a part with a relative that came, almost a beggar, to his door, unless in his heart he had some cause to fear him? Sorry about that book. So I hope you will be intrigued to read more. If I can find this copy, I will hand it over to you.